Chris.
Middle.
Ben, Kerry.
Okay.
Thank you very much, Kemi. And I feel when chairing a discussion with MPs, I never know whether I should sit in the middle between the two of you or sit at the side. But actually, we've got two MPs here today, very much focused on net zero. Both of you actually are back from the Labour Party conference this week. Chris, you were up there in disguise with your Mission Zero coalition. And Kerry there, obviously, as shadow for climate change and within Ed Miliband's team there. I thought what we'd do for this session is invite our speakers just to say a few minutes at the beginning on where they see the future for net zero. So we're at this moment where in the UK we feel a bit rattled with net zero becoming a commitment that has been rowed back from, it's been questioned. So really the start is to hear from both the politicians. What's their vision? What's the future for net zero? Then we'll have a few questions, but then really we want to have a conversation. Ask questions from the floor and interact with you. So maybe, Chris, I mean, you signed the net zero pledge into law. You were there at the time. Your recent report, I think, talks about the 129 recommendations on how to deliver. So maybe we start with you. What did you sign us up for? Where are we, and how do we get there?
So, I mean, the talk is how do we keep net zero alive? And I know we're going to come on to some of the domestic challenges in a moment. But for myself, you know, it really is a sort of tale of two worlds. On the one hand, if you'd asked me 4 years ago, when I took forward the legislation, amended the Climate Change Act, so the UK became the first G7 country to sign net zero by 2050 into law, I simply wouldn't have believed you that 4 years on we'd have 93% of global GDP having signed up to a net zero target of some form, 80% of all countries globally. I wouldn't have believed you that the US, you know, having sort of pulled out of the Paris Agreement under Trump, would now come back to the climate stage with the Inflation Reduction Act and the Build Back Better Act with 370 billion, if not more, of investment in climate technologies. I wouldn't have believed you that the EU would have come forward with its Fit for 55 program of 55% sort of emissions reduction, and I wouldn't have believed you that we would have got the the Glasgow Climate Pact across the line that sort of would not only have completed the Paris Agreement, but would also have committed countries, as they will do in COP28, coming forwards with looking again at their national determined contributions. So, on the one hand, you know, we are moving forwards. On the other hand, you know, net zero is entering a dangerous territory. I mean, for me, obviously, it's whether we can demonstrate as one of the leading countries over the past 20 years of how we can, you know, cut our carbon dioxide emissions by 50%, to continue that trajectory. Can we hit our 68% emissions reduction target for our national determined contribution for 2030? Because net zero isn't about 2050. I know a lot of people in the room would say, you know, net zero should never have been out 2050. We need to act now. We need to halve global emissions by 2030. But the pathway we are on towards net zero by 2050 requires us to focus on the next 80 months. And that's why I think, you know, domestically, from a UK standpoint, it was so frustrating, if not tragic, that we saw the Prime Minister come forwards claiming that he had a master plan for doing net zero in a better way, and one that was going to be not costly. Because for myself, while there were some announcements in his speech, which were welcome, you know, increasing the allowance for the boiler upgrade scheme to £7,500, and actually on the other hand, I think the government's engaging in a bit of green hushing. They're still getting on with the EV mandate. Nothing's changed, to use Theresa May's words. When it comes to looking at the heat pump target and the EV target, they've just carved out exceptions in a way that there are always going to be exceptions. But what has happened, and what I think we all need to work towards at the next general election, because whoever forms the next administration is going to be under their stewardship, that we will either see us meet our national determined contribution or not, is this rhetoric, is this tone. Because net zero, as my review set out, is the economic opportunity of this decade, if not our generation. And we can either take a net zero path, have the first mover advantage, you know, all the companies that are here exhibiting are world leading in some respects and giving them the opportunity to thrive, to grow, to create the jobs, the regeneration that we can see that net zero can provide, that the US, that Germany all recognize as being the opportunity. But if we cast net zero as being something in the too difficult box or a cost, then almost that sort of vicious circle downwards is going to continue. That actually, we're signing our own death warrant when it comes to climate change if we're not willing to actually step out and say, this is the moment, and we can be positive, and there is a sense of hope and opportunity, but that requires politicians to be honest with people about the costs of delay, not necessarily the cost of the transition, because it's all going to cost more the longer we leave it.
Yeah, thank you. And Kerry, you're just fresh back from party conference, I say the glitter and glamour of party conference. But you're on, Keir Starmer appointed you as shadow minister for climate change. You're on Ed Miliband's front bench team. Where do you see the future of net zero and your vision for that?
Okay, I'm not sure about fresh back from Labour Party conference. Anyone who's ever been to a party conference will know that by the end, you're surviving on 5 hours of sleep a night, if that, and I think I did about 16 fringe events plus go into other events where you're just constantly talking to people. So yeah, but I will try to keep my energy levels up. For those of you who thought you might be in for a bit of a political bun fight between the two of us, I have to say that on this issue, not on other issues, Chris and I actually agree with rather a lot. And if you had perhaps wanted the bun fight, Chris is my constituency neighbour. My other Tory constituency neighbour is Jacob Rees-Mogg. And it has to be said that on net zero, we're in very different places.
We want to talk about the future of net zero.
Exactly. Yeah. So, not taking us back to the before even the Industrial Revolution, I think, with Jacob. But so, and I'm glad that Chris did mention the very disappointing, I think he said, if not tragic, rowback on net zero and the attempt to sort of place it at the centre of these cultural wars. It's politicising an issue where there should be consensus. And I'm very fond of quoting Al Gore in his sequel to The Inconvenient Truth. There's a line which I keep meaning to go back and actually sort of write down. It's something like, I've been doing this so long, I know that I am right, and I'm not going to bother, he's not going to bother debating the climate change deniers, and even like the delayers, he's just going to make the positive case for getting on with things. And Labour could have responded to what Rishi Sunak said by, particularly because of the Uxbridge by-election, which perhaps is why he did it, I don't know, and the sort of row about you, Les. We could have wobbled a bit, but instead we've doubled down because we absolutely know that this is the right thing to do, and that sense of urgency that Chris talked about, it's not 2050, has to be front-loaded, and that is why Keir Starmer's made one of his 5 missions, the clean power by 2030. And so we have a very clear commitment. We want to double onshore wind, triple solar and quadruple offshore wind. And there's been setbacks to the recent auction round for offshore wind. The price was set at such a level that no contracts were awarded. So, it's frustrating because you hope that if we get into government next year, there'll have been some progress between now and then, but things seem to be going backwards. So just in terms of like the practicalities of it, what we've done is identify the obstacles to us getting there. And one is investment, although I'm constantly told by businesses that if we create a stable economic environment where we say where we want to get to and how we're going to get there, and we don't divert from that, there is a lot of private sector money that will invest just so long as they know that, we can talk about maybe things like home retrofitting and that, where there's been such mixed signals over the years. We know there's the rowback now on the 2030 deadline for phasing out the sale of petrol and diesel cars. That is not helpful at all for business. Even the businesses that might not have liked those targets when they were first being talked about, once they're in place, they adapt, they want that certainty. So investment, I think, there is money out there that's ready to invest, and we need to we are looking very closely at what Joe Biden's done with the Inflation Reduction Act, and particularly how he's using subsidies to help areas where either, high unemployment, so deprived communities, but ones where, there have been the energy-intensive industries, so, in Texas, for example, where they know that there's going to be a need for just transition. taking communities with you by showing that there's huge potential to move into green jobs instead. We're also looking at skills. We're absolutely, hundreds of thousands of potential jobs, but we need to make sure that people are trained and retrained to do them. Grid connection, that was something that Rachel Reeves made an announcement on. At the moment, huge delays to get grid connections for businesses, for new housing. We've absolutely got to sort that out. We've got to look at anticipatory demand as well, so that we don't just wait for businesses to come to us and then join the queue, and in 10 years' time they might get their grid connection. We need to think about what a decarbonised country that is heavily reliant on electricity, what the needs will be. And then the last thing is planning, which again you'll have heard things about at Labour conference, that if you want this to happen at the pace that it needs to happen, again, we can't have everything bogged down. At the moment, there's a de facto ban on onshore wind. One person can object to it, and it just doesn't happen. Except the one wind turbine that has gone up in recent years was actually in Lawrence West, ambitious Lawrence West. And so Bristol's got its one wind turbine, but I mean, that is pretty pathetic. We need to have hundreds of wind turbines being rolled out across the country. So again, that is Labour saying tough choices will have to be made, but there is no alternative to actually really sort of accelerating this programme.
Yeah, thank you. Chris, coming back to you, I think you talked about green hushing. There is still a lot happening, but I do want to come back on this question of using net zero as a culture wars topic. I think there's a lot of shock around that something so serious is used in a divisive way. And I think this is a small little setting here, very personal. How does it feel, you as a Conservative MP, to suddenly hear that that's a message that's going out there? How does that feel to you?
Well, I mean, from my own perspective, it's completely, absolutely and utterly the wrong thing to do. I am a Conservative MP. I chair the cross-party group on the environment in the House of Commons. Regardless of people's political affiliation, there are people who vote Conservative who care passionately about climate change, and it is one of these things that I just feel it's unwound 15 years of what was a very sort of careful sort of journey from the Conservative Party that sort of decided to work with the Labour Party when they were in government on the Climate Change Act.
And the platform of hosting COP.
And for me, it's also that case of demonstrating the moral leadership to other countries, because through that legislation, through it being cross-party, on that is built the Committee on Climate Change's sort of legal responsibility. And my worry now is that once you open this door, then suddenly, as it happens with any culture war, everything is up for grabs. So now we've seen misrepresentation of the Committee on Climate Change that has to be independent and doesn't shouldn't be used by party politics whatsoever. And that's where does it stop now?
Yes,
because once you are willing to cross that divide, by all means, let's have it. We can have a debate around the net zero grid and whether it should be 2035 or it should be 2030. That's what politics should be about. Mm-hmm. Looking at sort of focusing on the detail, but the overwhelming case from as you said, what we see now is that those who are the climate deniers 10, 15 years ago have recognized they're not going to win the climate argument. The science has proven where we are overwhelmingly. And what they've moved to now is this sort of delaying tactic. Oh, it's too hard. We're going too far, too fast. That somehow anyone who's been focusing on net zero is an eco-zealot. I mean, I personally have come out against Rosebank. I personally think it's totally the wrong thing to do to promise industries that are high carbon that they're still going to be around in 50 years' time when we're rapidly moving to new industries. But they're looking for any wedge issue, so that you've got other people now sort of saying, oh, we'll form an alliance with the GMB union. That's a pretty unholy alliance, and also it's a pretty cynical alliance, because there's no way that some people in the Tory party are ever going to agree with the GMB union on anything else, but they're looking to try and create these new coalitions. But you wonder what they're doing it for, because ultimately it is about just delaying. And as I said, delaying is obviously not just disastrous for what we're facing, it's also economically the wrong thing to do. And that question of honesty, and the way they've turned it to say, we're going to be honest with you, we're going to level with you, we're going to make sure you're not paying £10,000 to £15,000 to have insulation. It doesn't cost that to do basic level of insulation, and that's the challenge that actually put people off from even making the first step.
But it's also about confidence, and so it's also about the future journey, and I think there's a lot of businesses here as well, and that confidence question is so important. And I mean, maybe, Kerry, coming to you, I think there was the Labour were on this trajectory with everything you were setting out. Then it felt like there was a pulling back from the 28 billion Green Deal, and just it felt like a bit of a wobble at that moment. But is the commitment still there? Is that longer term confidence still there? Where are you on Rosebank as well? It'd be great to hear just on some of those tougher questions.
Yeah, I mean, so the Green Prosperity Plan, 28 billion a year for capital investment in green sector. But we also, and it is important that we send out the signals to people that we're going to support them on that front. But also, in terms of the wider macroeconomic picture, we've got to establish our financial credibility, and Rachel Reeves has her fiscal rules about how debt's got to come down the first year. So you have to balance the two. So we are still committed to the 28 billion, but I mean, there was no way ever we were going to sort of get into government and start spending day one anyway, because you have to, the things that will unlock that investment, sorting out the grid, sorting out the planning system, seeing how we can enhance, have the skills there to actually meet the demand and all those things. So I think in some ways sort of announcing it as though it was going to be something that was going to be like 2024, you suddenly start getting the checkbook out, was probably, we hadn't quite thought that through. But we're still committed to that investment, and as I said, looking at what Joe Biden has now done. And it's disappointing again with, I think Jeremy Hunt has said that he will look at the UK response to IRA, because it's basically, if you're a business looking to invest at the moment, the US is a far more attractive environment than it is in the UK. So I don't know, I mean, perhaps Chris could say whether he is expecting something from the Chancellor in the autumn to sort of at least try to, never going to be able to directly compete with the US because we don't have the money to do it, but at least something that will help businesses along that line. And also, one of the things I think is it's wrong to just look at public sector investment, because there are other things that you can do. So if you look, say, at the EV market, Chris mentioned the ZEV mandate, so for manufacturers to make sure a certain percentage of their car production is electric. There were things like plug-in grants that were, in terms of spending, but then there was the ban on the ICE vehicles. So there's lots of different levers you can use to get the market to where you want it to be. And the more conversations I have with business and with organisations like I always forget, it's UK SIF, so Sustainable Investment, is it? And, yeah. But they're saying they've got trillions that is just ready to be spent so long as they've got confidence that the government would be behind it. So public money should only really be used to sort of guarantee, remove some of the risk element, or to invest in things that perhaps can't attract that private finance.
And as well as businesses, also, there's an important role here around a just transition.
Yeah.
And I think it's a term that people are clearer on, but it's how do we ensure that this journey that we're going to go on doesn't disproportionately affect different communities, actually different businesses around the UK. Maybe, Chris, just a few of your thoughts on that, because you set out with your plan the recommendations, but a number of communities are worried.
Yeah, and I think the important thing here is to recognise that net zero is not going to be achieved by central government alone. Indeed, it shouldn't be. I think the Committee on Climate Change recognised over half of all net zero policy decisions would need to be taken outside of Westminster and Whitehall. And as far as I was concerned, doing the net zero review, the largest ever engagement exercise undertaken on net zero, the more that we can get responsibilities, powers, funding out of central government's hands and into the hands of local leaders. Now, whether that's metro mayors, and we've got a number of exciting pilots on the Trailblazer pilots in Manchester and the West Midlands, focusing on delivering sort of retrofits where they'll receive the money. In Bristol, obviously, and Kerry's just spoken about blended sort of finance, but the Bristol City Leap, if we can take that model and expand that rapidly to other cities, I think for me, the greatest challenge with the just transition is the delay just widens the gap. So we saw that with the retrofit announcement for minimum energy efficiency standards. It's going to cost £8 billion over 10 years. The people who are going to miss out on having the cheaper energy bills are tenants who deserve to be living in decent properties. And actually, when we raise the minimum energy efficiency measures around F and G, everyone complains saying they're going to sell their properties. They didn't in the end. They did what they needed to do. And so actually, getting government out of the way and making sure that that funding can get down into local communities as soon as possible actually means that money can be best spent in the areas that people know it needs to be spent. So I'm a big believer in the sort of local big bang, as it were. How do we make more communities authors of their own sort of net zero stories? What we can't afford to do is have to wait. I think the challenge is around the just transition, is that there are areas of just transition, as I said, around moving from high carbon industries to low carbon industries, how we ensure that decarbonisation never leads to deindustrialisation, because we'll lose then the net zero narrative on new jobs for the future. That's also an important part of the just transition as well. But that journey can be accelerated and made more effective. And also it costs less. That's the other thing.
Yeah,
the research has shown if you can take this funding and be sort of place-based, actually what you can deliver also in terms of the health benefits for local populations is all magnified by, I think, a factor of between 5 and 10. So that would be sort of my immediate priority for sort of focusing on this.
I think at this point, we want to just open up for conversation as well. The way we want to do this is to invite questions from the audience, but maybe we take 2 or 3 comments first and then have you both respond to those comments. So I've already seen a hand here and 2 hands there. So we start with the 3 of you. I'll make a note as well.
Hales. And is that working?
Can we hear? Can you hear the
Can't
question?
really hear.
Yep, okay, more or less working. I'll speak up. And I went out to supper a couple of nights ago with somebody who's an academic at Bristol University, and they said that they'd just split up from their girlfriend because they didn't want to have children because they'd lost hope. And I think that sometimes I feel that with this particular government that we have there, they don't understand the strength of feeling and the despair that is with our youth. And actually, I've been really impressed with the conversation on the stage, because I have lost respect for many of the MPs when they're talking about environmental issues. There is such huge ignorance for most of them, really not understanding these issues. And I think it's completely exemplified by your Minister of the Environment, Therese Coffey. And what I would say was, why don't you replace her?
We'll take 3. I've written that one down. We'll take the other 2 so we have a chance.
Hi, thank you. I sort of just want to say it's actually really, really nice to be at a political talk where you're not throwing buns at each other, and the debate is very intelligent. So thank you for that. My question is really around policy and policy change. So I'm a researcher from the University of Exeter. There's been a lot of work which you may be aware on involving Tim Lenton and Simon Sharp, and they've sort of been looking a little bit at how would you redesign policies to implement positive tipping points in the environment.
I do apologise, because there's a lot of noise from here. We couldn't hear that part of the question.
Oh, okay.
Do you mind just saying that again?
Is that louder?
Yeah, that's better.
Okay, I'll shout. Where did you lose me?
You said there's a lot of debate about, and then...
Okay. So about policy. So there's been a lot of research about whether or not policy can be redesigned to sort of implement positive tipping points, specifically in the environmental sector. So an example of that is what Norway's done with electrical vehicles and how positive that's been. And my question for both of you really is, do you think there's a future where policy can be redesigned on either party side, or are we too sort of stuck in the old ways?
Thank you very much. And then there's a person behind you as well.
Hello.
Hi.
My question is all about accountability. Both of you have been very candid in your disappointment and the lack of confidence, and that there is funding available and solutions potentially available, but it's not going to happen because the ground is shaking and there's U-turns and there's back rolls and all these things. Who is being held accountable for the fact that your parties, both of you, all of you, are not being consistent? Business, it's a long investment for many, and they want to put the effort and the time in. But if there's going to be U-turns, who's being held accountable for this?
Yeah. Superb question. Thank you so much.
All good.
Chris, I'm not sure it's within your power to change someone, but we've got a question about hope, policy change redesigned, and the accountability question.
So I think the question of hope and framing what I think the majority of the population, all the polling shows, even people who vote Conservative, that they support net zero, more than 50% of Conservative voters. So I personally think this culture war, or trying to go after some core vote post-Uxbridge, is potentially disastrous. And trying to make the case that this next election, whenever it comes next year, needs to be a climate election. Net zero was in the front page of every political manifesto. We need to have that same sense of purpose of organising, and it's not the sort of just stop oil type of sort of narrative, because that sort of works against sort of trying to get what you need, but making sure that those in marginal constituencies really make their voice heard is going to be important, because that's what politicians will be looking to form majorities. And so I hope, and I've created a Westminster Climate Declaration actually, which I launched in New York, which is trying to find common ground. And I'll be pushing that both at from a candidate perspective, but also from a local authority perspective. And I would say also we've got the May elections next year, where the mayors will be up for election. I think that's quite critical, because actually Andy Street, Andy Burnham, a lot of these mayors want extra powers. So there's another additional case to be made of getting politicians at Westminster out of the way. And the more we can make sure that people like myself are less relevant, I think the better. That when it comes to policy framework design, of course you've got this sort of incremental approach sometimes, and the contract for difference is a classic example of that, because now everyone wants a contract for difference for every single technology under the sun, because it's worked. What I would say, however, what I did with the Net Zero Review, was the reason why I called it Mission Zero is that you have these 10-year missions. Is I'm a big believer in Mariana Mazzucato's sort of long-term mission-based approach. How can we, like with Horizon Europe, with research and development funding, how do we break out of this, the tyranny of the spending review cycle? Because at the moment, that's the real challenge that's holding everything back. When you look at net zero investments, as the lady at the back, you need the 10 to 15-year commitment from a government that it will be an active partner, a stable partner, and won't pull the plug. So if you can create the policy framework through a mission that then everyone will sign up to. And actually, we're moving in this way. So the government's created Great British Nuclear, where they're committing to several, now regardless what you think of nuclear, the point is it can be done. They're doing it over several parliaments. They've committed £20 billion over 20 years to CCUS. My view is if they can create these policy vehicles for certain technologies, why not do it for energy efficiency, like they've done with the KfW in Germany? Why not, do it for what they've the tax credits, like the 45Q tax credits, guaranteed to the 1st of January 2033 in the States. And for me, it's not always about the money; it's about the stability that's the really critical thing. So I think the policy redesign is really important, but it's going to have to start with the Treasury, and that's where I hope we've got the autumn statement on the 22nd of November. We'll see what this government's ambition is, but if this government's ambition is not to go further, I hope that Keir Starmer's talked about missions, that we can really embed this language and this process for the future.
Thanks. Kerry.
Okay. On the last question, I'll just echo what Chris said, and Keir has got these 5 missions, and you will inevitably, because things happen, whether it's COVID, whether it's the war in Ukraine, there will be things that mean that you have to revise where you are. But I think giving that clear sense of future direction and not just like long-term targets with no plan to get them, and the government's being taken to court because its net zero strategy doesn't, there's not a roadmap to get there. And I think it's really important that you you're honest, you're not just holding out hope that at some point in the distant future that you won't be empowered by the time it comes to be held accountable for that. In terms of, I think your question was really good. And I did a few events at Party Conference where we were talking about young people. So there was one with the Prince's Trust, for example. There's quite a lot of youth climate campaigners around. And I think it's really important that we don't just... My colleague Nadia Whittam, who was the baby of the House until recently, she was 23 when she got elected, and we just had a by-election winner who's younger. But she is persuaded, she's been working with an organisation called Teach the Future, calling for climate education in schools, and Labour has now said that it absolutely supports that. But I think what is important, I think in the past, when it has been taught, it's been about what's going horribly wrong. So they're learning about melting ice caps and the polar bears not having, the habitat, and rising sea levels and the Maldives disappearing underwater, whatever, and extreme weather events. That is important because that alerts people to the danger of not keeping to 1.5 degrees. But we need to talk about it in a way that shows that they could be part of the solution and talk about what can be done to address this, because otherwise you have this sort of existential despair. So in terms of linking it to green jobs, and there's so many green jobs, we're looking at things like Tony Juniper from Natural England wants a national nature force where young people go out and actually work on nature-based solutions to climate change, planting trees, restoring wetlands, planting seagrass meadows, really exciting stuff that'll engage them. But even if you're going to be an accountant, you can be an accountant that also provides advice to companies on reducing their carbon footprints. SMEs at the moment, my dad was a demolition contractor. If you'd sort of said to him, how are you going to reduce your carbon footprint, I think he'd have told you where to go. But, perhaps he would have had an accountant that could have given him some advice. So just saying to young people that there are opportunities for you, even in a small way, to be part of this transformation. And in terms of just, to raise coffee, I agree. But I've gone head-to-head with Therese Coffey a lot over the years when she was a junior environment minister, because I was on the two select committees, environmental audit and EFRA, that she frequently gave evidence to. And my biggest problem with her is she doesn't really believe in the role of government to do things. So even if it was things like, trying to stamp out single-use plastics, we know that a very simple measure like the 5p levy on plastic bags, it reduced use by over 80% in the first year. It works. And there's a sort of three-part triangle. There's consumers, and Therese will always talk about, well, it's a matter of choice for individual consumers, what they purchase, what they eat, etc. There's the market, which would respond to that or would help things along because they sense they can make money out of it. And then the third thing is government, and I think the plastic bags is just an ideal example of you get there a hell of a lot quicker if the government does something. And I just say there's been a real abdication of responsibility. I mean, the tipping points, I think the whole circular economy is a classic example of where, just with small measures, you could really, really change things quickly. And there's just not that ideological approach to things at the moment,
Thank you.
At least coming from her.
We're ridiculously out of time, unfortunately, but Kerry and Chris are here. They're around. Please come and chat to them. And I think the point made there about hope was really, really important. I find that we can scroll social media, we can look at the papers, we can hear these arguments, and you can just feel that weight of lack of hope, of despair. And maybe just in a very brief sentence, we don't have time, where do we find hope at the moment, Chris?
I think we find hope in the fact that this still remains one of the few multilateral processes that people are committed to. I think we find hope in the next generation. I think we find hope in polling that shows that more people are interested than ever before in taking action. So I personally am optimistic about the future. I think that the challenge is how do we ensure that we take every sort of negative and try and, rather than drill down on it as a negative, how do we bend that arc and make it a positive opportunity?
And Kerry?
Yeah. I'll just say, at the moment, we're in a position where we can keep to 1.5 degrees. It's getting more difficult by the day, but that is possible if we take the action that we need. And in terms of also the dual nature thing, in terms of reversing the decline in nature by 2030, we can do it. And it is, it's about having that positive end goal in sight, but not... it's having the courage to just recognise that it's absolutely the only way that we can do it. And if we even sort of take our foot off the pedal and go a little bit slower, we will miss that opportunity altogether.
Thank you very much. Come and chat to Chris and Kerry afterwards. Thank you very much for your time and attending. And thanks to Chris Skidmore and Kerry McCarthy.